Hi, this is Gayatri. Welcome back to the course on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Today we'll study Sutra number 5, but first a small prayer. Trayambakam yajamahe sugandhim pushtivardhanam urvarukamiva bandhanam mrityor mukshiyamamritat. Today, let's look at Sutra number 5. Vrittyah panchatayah klishtaha. What does this mean? In Maharshi Vyasa's commentary, as you know, we're using the version as interpreted by Professor Ganganath Jha. The 5th sutra is translated as, the functions are fivefold. They are painful and not painful. The painful functions have their source in afflictions. They become the ground for the aggregate of karmic residue. The non-painful have true knowledge for their object and are opposed to the activity of the attributes. So, we understand that we have functions of the mind. These functions are fivefold. And each of these functions are either painful or not painful. If they are painful, they derive from afflictions, the afflicted mind. And when they arise from the afflicted mind, they become the ground for karmic residue. Those actions have karmic consequences. Non-painful action arises from true knowing of the object. And because it truly knows the object, it is opposed to the activity of the attributes. It is not spent in furthering itself into karmic residue. When the non-painful functions appear amidst the painful ones, they remain non-painful. And when the painful ones remain painful amidst the non-painful ones, that is, what he's saying is the two don't mix. Non-painful remains non-painful, painful remains painful, even when they both seem to appear within each other or within close proximity to each other. I will explain this point a little more when we come to B.K.S. Iyengar's explanation of whether they are intermingled. Tendencies of one kind are brought about by the functions of the same kind. Functions are also brought about by the tendencies. This wheel of functions and tendencies keeps revolving until we attain yoga or communion. What are these functions and tendencies? That is what the next 5 sutras are going to explain to us. Once this comes to an end, the cycle, the mind either remains like spirit or dissolves. And what are these functions, painful, non-painful? Right now in this sutra, you have 2 bits of information about them. One is that they are fivefold, and second is they are to be described in the following sutras. Modifications of the mind are fivefold. They are painful or non-painful. It's also how Swami Satyananda translates it. So there's no major differentiation between the translations themselves among the gurus in this sutra. But there is great differentiation in the explanations. This sutra says that the vrittis of the mind, the modifications, are of 5 kinds. These 5 are either painful or non-painful. Therefore, Swami Satyananda points out, there are 10 modifications of the mind. Each is painful and each is non-painful. How do we understand this? You see a flower. Your eyes assume its shape. And then you enjoy through the sense organs its shape. This is aklishta, that is pleasant. The same eyes see the body of a dog, say crushed by a vehicle in traffic. You assume the imagery and you do not enjoy the imagery. This is klishta, this is painful. The modification of vritti is the same. The perception passes through the eyes. the result is either painful or not painful. So before you understand what the 5 modifications are, you need to understand what vritti itself is. Though we have studied it in the first few sutras, Swami Satyananda says that is not sufficient. You have to really understand what a vritti is, because it's going to keep coming up. So, vritti is basically the manifestation of the mind in different spheres. So, whether you look at a person, tree, or object, you see it through the eyes. That is a vritti. When you're listening to music, or you're listening to a seminar, or you're listening to somebody speaking to you, it is a modification through the ears. That is a vritti. Closing your eyes and recollecting your memory of music, or a flower that you saw, or a person, is also a modification of the mind. That is also a vritti. When you feel grief, anger, jealousy, hatred, love, devotion, that is also a modification of the mind. That is also a vritti. Every dimension of knowledge is a vritti. Sleeping, dreaming states, illusions are also vrittis. A vritti is basically a mental factor. He cites Gauda Patacharya, who is a guru of Adi Shankaracharya, who wrote a detailed commentary of the Mandukya Upanishad. In it, he wrote, "The whole world seems to be nothing more than one of the vrittis or mental modifications of a supreme consciousness. The world itself, the extended universe beyond, may be just an expression of your mind, a vritti. In a play, the same person may change costume and emerge in different roles: protagonist, villain, cat, mouse, or tree. The stuff of origin is the same and pervasive. It just manifests differently through different modifications of the mind. Each of these modifications, the sum of the modifications, falls into one or other of these 10 categories or 5 oppositions." This is how to understand this particular sutra. Is you really have to, according to Swami Satyananda, focus on the vritti. Swami Vivekananda keeps it simple. He says there are just simply 5 classes of modifications: painful and not painful. And in this sutra, he doesn't go into further explanation. B.K.S. Iyengar says the movements of consciousness are 5-fold. They may be cognizable or non-cognizable, painful or non-painful. So he has introduced an extra category here for you to understand. Fluctuations or modifications of the mind may be cognizable or non-cognizable, and painful or non-painful. Pain may be hidden in the non-painful state, and non-painful may be hidden in the painful state. Contrast this with what Professor Ganganath Jha translates Maharshi Vyasa as saying. Maharshi Vyasa says that they are separate. Painful remains painful, non-painful remains non-painful even when they are in proximity. B.K.S. Iyengar says that the painful can contain the non-painful, and the non-painful can contain the painful. What does he mean by this? He says that when consciousness takes the lead, the seer, that is the witness, takes a back seat. And the seed of modification is in that consciousness, it is not in the witnessing. So, consciousness sees objects according to its own proclivities of the mind. And it creates these fluctuations, modifications, and it creates a disturbance. These disturbances are of 5 kinds. These are the vrittis. Consciousness, which you may translate as chitta, involves the seer with the sense objects in 5 ways of modification, and these 5 ways of modification can be divided and subdivided indefinitely. The arising thoughts associated with anguish are klishta, and he gives a very useful example here. He says, if you see a live coal and it is covered with ash and you touch it, what happens? You are burnt. When it was covered with ash, it was klishta, that is non-cognizable. And when it manifested as a burn, it became klishta or cognizable. pain is dominant here. Okay. So, but just as, and this is B.K.S. Iyengar's example, just as the pleasure of sex results in labor pains when a child is born, which is unimaginable pain. Okay. You have klishta and aklishta. And then from that, unimaginable pain, you have the joy at the birth of the child. Okay. So again, you're going from klishta to aklishta. In that same manner, pain is embedded in pleasure and pleasure is embedded in pain. So he jumps ahead a little here in his explanation, and he notes that in Sutra 19, Patanjali warns even highly enlightened souls who may have reached the painless blissful state that is described in Sutra 18, that though the yogi may be free when certain virtuous potencies are dominant, when they fade, the yogi must strive again. So it is not a state where you attain witness and you're permanently in witness. Your virtues may arise, you may be able to subdue the mind, the chitta, the gunas. But when that is spent, you will have to go back to that state of striving. Pain can be hidden for a long time until it rises to the surface and reveals itself as painful, such as when there's cancer in the body. Right? So, what B.K.S. Iyengar focuses on in the sutra is that what is pain and what is not pain is not always apparent. And therefore, what is cognizable and what is non-cognizable becomes important. Prakriti causes modifications to arise in klishta forms. And Purusha causes afflictions to arise in aklishta form. So, when nature is involved, and remember that yoga is basically an arm of the Sankhya philosophy. So, B.K.S. Iyengar explains Sankhya, which fundamentally believes in the Purusha Prakriti duality. Purusha being the supreme consciousness, Prakriti being its manifested form in nature. So that manifested form in nature, Prakriti, causes modifications to arise in klishta form, which causes pain. Purusha causes afflictions to arise in aklishta form, that is non-misery. For example, and this is a very useful example, memory is bondage in Prakriti. You're tied to people, attachment. But it becomes the faculty of discrimination in Purusha. So the same thing, memory, is klishta in Prakriti and it's aklishta in Purusha. And he says both these states can be hidden or revealed, and both can be stopped by yogic practice. If chitta is the wheel, klishta or klishta are the two spokes that cause the fluctuations, and the vrittis that manifest from them feed into and support each other. When the wheel is at rest, vritti cease, chitta also ceases. Osho translates it as the modifications of the mind are 5. They can be either a source of misery or of non-misery. Mind can be either a source of bondage or freedom, Osho points out. And his focus in the sutra is to say that, the mind is capable of both misery and non-misery. It is the gate to the world, and you can either enter by it or you can exit by it. And what he's basically saying is mind can make it either heaven or hell. The right use of mind is meditation, the wrong use is madness. And all techniques of yoga are concerned only with one issue, that is how to use the mind correctly. Used correctly, it starts dissolving and it becomes no mind. Used incorrectly, it becomes chaos. The madman in the madhouse and the Buddha under the Bodhi tree both use the mind. For the Buddha, the mind disappears. You and your mind cannot sustain simultaneously. One or the other has to disappear. And why are you in misery? You are in misery because you are following the mind. You are not its master. You are its slave, and you don't have the capacity to command it to stop. You don't want to think, it goes on thinking. You want to sleep, it doesn't stop. The mind, he says, is an instrument just like legs. it is essential. So if a Buddha who has attained this dissolution, inhibition of the chitta, and is established as a witness, if he wants to speak to you, he has to use the mind, because the mind has to manifest that consciousness through speech, and it has to reach you. So mind is essential. We are not going to be functioning without mind. The difference is that the mind has no hold over a Buddha. The Buddha becomes a mirror. When something is in front of the mirror, it gets reflected. When that thing is gone, it is gone. You and I are not mirrors. Long after the sense object is gone, we retain its form, we retain its shape, we retain its sound, we sit with its memory, we contemplate it, we discuss it, we debate it. Okay, we continue to think about it. Mind is essentially not separate from the body. And this is a very interesting insight that Osho has. He says, this is what is Patanjali's greatest sort of insight through the Yoga Sutras, is that mind is not separate from the body. It is a state of the body that is deeply, deeply subtle. When you're intoxicated, this is his example, you may take in whatever drug or alcohol. Where are you taking it into? You're taking it into the body. What is affected? The mind is affected. That itself shows you that the mind is not separate from the body, but in fact is the subtlest part of the body. And the reverse is also true. If you influence the mind, you influence the body, such as with hypnosis. Or with an everyday example is sleep. Right? The days when we don't sleep, we're not able to physically function. And he says this is actually Patanjali's greatest insight, and it's something that they are studying today in labs in the West. They call it psychosomatic or mind-body connect. But this is what yoga is to reach the mind through the body and reach the body through the mind. The body has 5 organs, 5 indriyas, senses of activity. The mind has 5 functions. So the mind and the body are actually one, but speaking through each other. When you go back to Sutra 3 or 2 and you listen again to B.K.S. Iyengar's explanation in Sutra 1 and 2, he also brings this up, and he says, he takes it actually one step further, and he says the body has 5 organs, we have 5 indriyas or senses, the mind has 5 functions, but also the world has 5 elements. And therefore, everything is a projection of the other, and we're able to draw the world, the 5 elemental factors of the world, through the 5 functions of the mind, through the 5 indriyas into the 5 functions of the mind. So the mind and the body, B.K.S. Iyengar would say, and the world are one. And the expression of the mind through each of these creates 5-fold manifestation. Each of these modifications can cause dukkha, misery, if not used correctly. The word non-misery is important. Patanjali doesn't say it will lead you to ananda or bliss. He's very precise. At best, it can lead you to non-misery. If you're in non-misery, bliss, which is your inner nature, will start to flow. Even the Buddha never says the path will lead you to bliss. He says he will lead you out of misery. Non-misery does not come from the mind. That comes from your inner nature. If mind is in misery, it is a hindrance. If mind is not in misery, it becomes open. It's like a window. So one of the characteristics of misery, Osho says, is being closed. You become closed off to people, to events, to circumstances, to relationships, to connections, to ideas, to growth. And this is why in misery people begin to consider suicide, which is destroying of oneself or others, and a complete closure or shutting down, a complete disconnection. Patanjali says the mind can do one or the other, create misery or non-misery. Mind cannot give you bliss. But once you get the mind to be open, to be still, to stop creating misery, you create non-misery. And when you create non-misery, the window is open, and it's like you can let the air in, you can let the sunlight in, and you make space for bliss to flow. Barbara Stoller Miller translates it as the turnings of thought, whether corrupted or immune to the forces of corruption, are of 5 kinds. Now, why does she use the term corruption? She uses corruption to signify misery arising out of modifications. She goes into further detail in this in Sutra 4 to 9 in the second pada, but for now what you need to know is that the forces of corruption, and she uses the word klesha, which is also a very Buddhist word. Okay? She says arises out of a base of ignorance. It is the basic manifestation. And through our contact with the phenomenal existence, it motivates our actions in the world. So basically, ignorance becomes this ground. It becomes the ground for our contact with objects. And because we are functioning from a basis of ignorance, it motivates our actions in the world. And it creates further, for instance, subtle workings, thoughts, emotions, which enmesh us further. And it is only by distancing ourselves from this chaos through yoga, we can diminish the power of corruptions over us through chitta vritti nirodha. Thank you for listening to Sutra 5. In the next sutras, I'll begin explaining what exactly the turnings of thoughts are, what each of those 5 modifications are.